Test fitting and preparation is super important here so you don't end up in a stressful situation with materials setting up and pieces not fitting together properly. Since we are dealing with a small sculpture, I will always prep carefully and make sure that the sculpture and the piece that I intend to attach are propped up properly so that they stay in place once put together. If gravity can be of any help, I try to use that as well, of course, and I test out many different configurations to make sure I find one that works well for what I intend to do. I will also pre-cut pieces of fiberglass and make sure they fit inside the sculpture the way that I'd like them to. Really large pieces of fiberglass, for example, can cause some problems here and be difficult to get inside the sculpture properly, leaving you with a poor connection and potential for pieces falling off or for fiberglass sticking out of the seam, neither of which are ideal scenarios. I will not only check the fit, but also carefully decide where each piece of fiberglass is supposed to go. I'll do my best to try to make sure that I don't get disorganized here and try to stay on top of things as best as I can. One of the harder things is actually remembering where each piece of fiberglass needs to go. What I'm doing here is attaching the fiberglass to the piece that I intend to bond to the figure, in this instance the right leg. Usually I'll attach fiberglass to the piece that's getting attached, in other words the piece that moves around and gets lifted into place, let's say. This seems to me to usually be the best approach, though perhaps in some cases the other way around might be preferable. I consider things like gravity when doing this as well, where can I attach a piece of fiberglass inside the piece I'm about to attach to the whole sculpture, so that when it's placed, gravity helps move the fiberglass onto the surface of the sculpture and hopefully bond the two together. If I don't consider gravity, then I might find myself in a situation where the fiberglass is not assisted by gravity and simply hangs in mid-air inside the sculpture, only attached to the one piece or the right leg in this instance, and not the big sculpture itself. And this would of course mean that there is no bond between the two pieces, and therefore they are unlikely to stay together during the trying circumstances most sculpture must go through. The trick here is to attach the fiberglass with hydro-resin inside the piece, of course. Dry fiber is going to be hanging outside the piece, and this fiber we will eventually wet with resin and attach to this big sculpture itself. But for now, we need it to be dry. You can run into some issues if you bring the resin you use to attach the fiberglass all the way to the edge of the piece. The fiber can become very stiff if you do it this way, and then it can get hard to get inside the sculpture when attaching the pieces. You can also mess up the edge of the piece as well, and it's much easier to have resin sort of run over the edge of the piece and onto the piece itself, sort of messing up the surface. I always try to make sure that the hydro-resin therefore stays deep inside the borders of the piece and that the fiberglass is attached not at the edge of the piece, but far inside the piece. I'm fairly lucky here in the beginning that there are many openings in the sculpture. This means that I'll be able to get to the inside of the figure when attaching many of these pieces. Not all of them, but many of them, and especially the ones that are in the beginning, are going to have this feature. This is because the figure is made up of so many pieces that in the beginning, before we attach many pieces, there are large openings where pieces will eventually be added. This is beneficial since we can confirm whether or not the fiberglass has bonded and is laying down properly, flatly on the inside surface of our sculpture. Sometimes we can't see if this is the case, and that's where relying on things like gravity becomes very real very fast, and sort of your only option. In those instances, it's a little bit more tricky, and we'll have some of those here for you so you can see how I deal with those, as well as the pieces where the sculpture is more open and have room to observe the inside of the figure. It was important for me to consider the order of operations because of this. But this is very case by case basis, and therefore there isn't too much I can sort of teach you about the why I made these decisions to do things in the order that I decided to do. There is no concept here that you can apply to a piece that's different than mine, let's say. There is no universal truth. And this is partially why mold making and casting is so hard to learn and so hard to teach. What I can teach you is to consider the order of operations carefully. What goes on first and what impact will it have? Those are questions that you need to ask yourself. Try to visualize and plan ahead, and you'll be much better prepared if you do this. So with the hydro-resin used to hold the fiberglass onto the piece, this time the right leg, set up and dry, and the fiberglass firmly held in place inside the piece with no danger of falling out, we can proceed. First, I like to make sure that the inside of the sculpture, where the fiberglass is meant to contact the inside surface, is coated with a generous layer of resin. I make sure that I'm being rather generous with the area as well. Don't just go along the edge. The more of the inside surface that is coated, the greater chance the fiberglass will have to stick. So make sure you cover quite some ground inside your sculpture. It is also much better for the fiberglass if it sticks over a large area versus a small area. A larger area is going to provide a much stronger bond, of course. I start inside the sculpture because the chance of making a mess by leaving this sitting for a few seconds is very small. But adding resin to the piece first and then inside the sculpture later, that just means a much greater chance of letting the resin get everywhere all over the piece, creating a mess. So with the inside coated, I'll drench the fiberglass hanging from the piece in resin as well. Having resin on both is going to increase the chances of the fiberglass of the piece sticking and bonding to the sculpture. This has a greater chance of making an insane mess, as I mentioned, so I try to be careful here and minimize the amount of mess that I do create. Any spillover will be cleaned, and I try to make sure that my gloves don't get coated too badly with resin either. Wearing gloves, or perhaps wearing multiple gloves over each other, can be a useful trick here, since you'll be touching the resin a lot, getting very messy hands, and you'll be touching your sculpture as well. Multiple layers of gloves can be useful, since when one layer of gloves get messed up, you can rip them off and have clean gloves underneath. And believe me, getting gloves onto sweaty hands while material is dripping and drying can be a rather stressful and difficult scenario, so it's one you probably would prefer to avoid. We have 2 points of contact to consider here, where the base underneath the foot touches down onto the base of the sculpture and where the thigh of the piece meets the thigh of the sculpture. One of these contact points is ultimately more important than the other, and it's the thigh on thigh, of course. So why is this more important? It's more important because anatomically this bond being seamless and lining up properly matters much more. If the thigh on thigh doesn't work out, then we'll have an awkwardly bent thigh that will certainly look broken, which is not ideal. So I try to make sure I consider what contact point is more important, and then I'll favor that one over the other, letting the other one, in this scenario the base on base, be whatever it needs to be in order for the thigh to appear like it did in my sculpture. Hopefully both can be attached with no seam, of course, but that happens less than you would think, and working and planning for the real world rather than some sort of fantasy world seems to be more prudent to me. This was not something that I figured out while attaching the pieces together, of course. If you've watched the video series on casting this piece, you will have heard me talk about this idea for quite a while. I knew that dealing with 2 contact points that had crucial anatomy involved were going to be very difficult. Let's say that instead of the base on base, I had an ankle on an ankle, for example, the foot and the ankle being part of the sculpture, and the ankle of the leg piece needing to fit at the ankle and at the thigh. The chance for ending up with a less than ideal fit on one or perhaps both is tremendous and therefore rather risky in my opinion. Knowing this because I've experienced it in different sculptures, I decided to do my best to make sure I only had to deal with one crucial point of contact. Now I can work hard to make sure the thigh on thigh lines up perfectly, and then any issues with registration on the base I'll simply let it be and deal with it by resculpting the base in Hydro-resin. It's much easier, of course, to resculpt something abstract like the base in Hydro-resin compared to trying to resculpt something rather specific like the anatomy of a thigh. In terms of teachable concepts here that you can bring forth with you to your own projects, I think this one is going to be very useful. Always remember to limit the crucial points of contact to one if possible when making molds and casting sculptures that need pieces attached back together.